calendar is not unlike a story, but the story is much older. Stories likely emerged in the beginning stages of the development of more complex language by our early human or even pre-human ancestors. The invention of language is a process of abstraction. Even animals do this to some extent when they cry out a warning. It's not conscious, but their neural systems are hardwired to associate a single sound with something akin to an abstract concept like danger. When humans label objects and actions, they are also creating abstractions. Otherwise, each individual stone would have its own name, and the word stone as it's used today would not exist. The use of language to recount a series of events is an extension of this process. As humans evolved and improved their ability to hold abstract concepts in their minds, we became aware that other humans are privy to information we are not. This led us to the first questions, and by extension the first answers. But even today, for all the complexities and nuances of our languages, it is far easier to teach someone something by showing them than by telling them, and I think this is likely how the first stories came into existence. If you're feeling angry and someone asks you, "What's wrong?" If you respond, "I'm mad," they're not likely to be satisfied because they do not understand why and they can't help. You cannot simply tell them your condition as it is because they will not learn anything from that. You must show them why you're mad by explaining the conditions that made you feel that way. Then they will understand and maybe be able to help. This need to know the origin of something as a way to understand it permeates nearly every aspect of life, and is the central focus of this series as well. When you hear a new musician that you love, you want to know their story to better understand their music. When a new gadget makes your life easier, you want to learn how it works and what ingenious insight the inventor had that brought it to life. But stories are not purely informational. They're also entertaining, and this speaks to how advantageous it is to have the ability to represent people, objects, ideas, or events abstractly, and to weave them together in the form of a narrative. The only reason stories would evolve to such a point is that the better we became at telling them, the more we increased our chances of survival. If the only utility lay in exchanging dead information, stories would not progress beyond that point. But the capacity to imbue that information with the drama and emotion of tension and relief actually improved our ability to share information. What is truly fascinating, then, is to examine our stories and pursue the process of abstraction even further by extracting the common themes, ideas, and meanings, or the central information from them. If we do this across many ages and cultures, we can possibly discover the information we have collectively decided is the most important to convey to one another. But which stories shall we examine then? Well, to find the best stories, we need only look into history and ask ourselves, which stories have human beings continually decided are the most important to keep telling? The most pervasive, enduring, and compelling stories across all history have been myths and folk tales. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Grimm fairy tales, we still find reasons to discuss, meanings to extract, analogies for everyday life, and most importantly, wonderful entertainment in the myths and folk tales of our ancestors. For me, and many others, a myth is not a lie, as it is commonly thought to be. What most people are referring to when they use the word myth is actually a superstition, or an old wives' tale. But a myth is something much different and far greater than some baseless superstition. A myth is truer than any other kind of story ever composed by human beings, even a well-researched biography. A mythos is the most important knowledge of a people, boiled down to its most fundamental form and encoded in stories that are older than anything else we have from our ancestors. It is for this reason that I refer to the Holy Bible as a collection of myths, and will continue to do so throughout the rest of this series. But to clarify, when I do this, I am not saying the Bible is a lie, or in any way untrue. If anything, to me, it is the most true of all the myths, and the evidence for that is in the undeniable success of Christianity, the sheer number of Christians populating the world today, not to mention the Jews, whose mythos is the origin of the Christian mythos, and even the Muslims, whose mythos is deeply connected to the Christian and Jewish ones, though profound differences do abound. Whether or not the stories of any of these mythoi are literally true, or whether or not it was humans that composed them, is not relevant to this essay, because the truth within them that we will be drawing on comes from their archetypal motifs. The word archetype literally means original model, and it is often used this way in everyday speech or in mathematics. Similarly, in philosophy, it can be applied to Plato's theory of forms, the idea that the material things surrounding us in the world are false or cheap imitations of their abstract forms. For instance, the idea of a chair is truer or more perfect than any actual physical chair you may sit in. This is a very important idea to remember when we talk about archetypes, but we will be working with a more specific use of the word that comes mostly from the writings of Carl Jung. Jung was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and to him, an archetype was an unconscious pattern recognition mechanism that evolved naturally in human beings, and functioned similarly to an instinct in that it operated automatically and was something inherited, not taught. Much like Plato's abstract forms, a Jungian archetype is comparable to the purest version of an idea. However, they are not exactly the same, and most misunderstandings about Jungian archetypes comes from thinking of them as the Platonic forms of the characters, motifs, and symbols of myths, art, and dreams. My parents met in the year 1990 while following the band The Grateful Dead on their tours of the eastern United States. My mother comes from a musical background. Both of her parents are music teachers, and she's been singing since she was a girl. My father is a lover of music, a poet, and an amateur musician. They admired each other for their respective passions and skills with music, and they felt that the combination of their spirits and efforts would be a recipe for musical magic. Early on, they had the idea of starring together in a production of Jesus Christ Superstar, but as their relationship, and the world around them changed, they decided to put that energy into creating and raising a musical child, me. Unfortunately, their relationship would not last. To my mother, my father was an irresponsible and entitled screw-up. To my father, my mother was a tyrannical and obsessive perfectionist. But even though their relationship had failed, my mother still believed that the intention they had put into creating me was pure and worthy of her nurturing devotion. So, from the time I was born, she put every bit of energy she had to spare into immersing me in a world of music. While other kids were given action figures or gaming consoles on their birthdays, I was given new CDs or instruments. While other kids were taken to Disney World for a family vacation, we went to music festivals. Most importantly, while other kids had movie or comic book hero posters on their walls and printed on their t-shirts, I had rock stars on mine. My first major injury came when I stacked 2 footstools, one on top of the other, on the porch at a friend's house to create a small make-believe stage. I then climbed up and stood on top of them while pretending I was doing an epic guitar solo. They quickly toppled underneath me, and as I plummeted headfirst from the stone steps, my right collarbone broke my fall and broke in two. A few years later, On Halloween Eve, I relished the looks of awe in my neighbors' eyes as they opened the door, expecting to find a mummy or vampire, and instead found Paul Stanley of the band Kiss eagerly awaiting his next treat. To me, practicing guitar and piano and going to lessons were boring, and I fought my mother every day over them. As I'm sure every parent who has pushed their child to become talented and competent discovers, children don't see much use for skills. What I wanted to practice was being in the body of someone else, my heroes, the rock stars. My mother had surrounded me with idols dressed in glamorous outfits and standing above the heads of thousands of cheering fans, while they created sounds that moved the body, challenged the mind, and pulled on the emotions. That was a very compelling image for an impressionable young boy to see, and it spoke to something deep and primal within me. It called on me to find a way to take the essence of that image into myself, to embody its spirit. To the mind of a child, to reach the level of these exalted gods, I had to mimic the entirety of their actions. Practicing the skills necessary to actually make music seemed secondary to me. Rock stars like Jimmy Page, Randy Rhoads, and James Hetfield were my heroes. The idea of a hero is something many people probably take for granted. We've all had heroes at least one time in our lives. We worshipped them, we copied their behavior, and we aspired to mimic their accomplishments. But why do we do that? Is it something we're taught, or is it instinctual? The argument that a hero is a social construct is fairly weak. Heroes appear universally in every culture, even the pre-agricultural ones, and even some people with severe learning disabilities or other issues affecting the apprehension of learned social behavior still display behavior identifiable as hero worship. But it's not really good enough to just say that the hero is a universal figure, that our idolizing and mimicking heroes is universal behavior, and leave it at that. Hero is a good word to give us an idea of a Platonic form, but Jung's archetypes are something deeper, something more difficult to grasp. The word hero doesn't fully encompass every type of person that can be idolized and mimicked by another, and therefore the archetype is not the ideal image we normally conjure when we hear the word, of a courageous and muscled St. George facing down a terrifying and vile serpent. It's something more complex, but that image can help us better understand exactly what Jung was talking about. Imagine that built into your unconscious mind is an engine. The machine that this engine runs is what drives you to learn the proper skills and behavior necessary to become a competent and respected member of society. The fuel this engine runs on is the passion and meaning you derive from play when you're a child, practice when you're an adult, and the rewards of doing these things well. But this engine has an ignition system that requires a key to operate the ignition switch. Now, there is one key that works for almost everybody, and this key is the aforementioned St. George, the classic hero. But actually, there are potentially an infinite number of keys that will work on this ignition switch, and each individual has their own unique set of keys that the circumstances of their life has molded to match their switch. However, every variation of key that exists has to meet one very vague requirement in order to work the switch that we can best describe as displays heroic behavior, though in doing so, we still fall short of doing justice to just how abstract an idea it is, and how adaptable, how much an individual's circumstances can determine whether or not something meets that requirement. What we need to understand, however, is that the archetype is not the key, not even in its most basic and abstract form. The archetype is the ignition switch. It's the unconscious conditions under which an external event, person, theme, image, or character may be elevated to something more meaningful than objective existence, to something archetypal. The more universally something succeeds in meeting these conditions, like the courageous and muscled St. George, the more archetypal it is. In order for an archetype to be an inherited unconscious mechanism, it too must have evolved as the result of natural external pressures. It was likely the result of the demand for us to learn a vast quantity of incredibly complex behaviors in a relatively short period of time, so that we did not become an unbearable burden to our social groups. The system that made it through that pressure was mimicry, and the motivation to mimic was facilitated by the archetypes. But the archetypes didn't evolve solely to aid us in the learning of complex behavior. They also helped us with the older, more basic behaviors as well, such as the adaptations our species and those we interacted with underwent to thrive through the natural cycles and events of life on Earth, of day and night, full moon and new moon, spring, summer, autumn, winter, the year, and the lifetime. Similar to the effects of the calendar on our behavior, the archetypes also play into a sort of positive feedback mechanism, whereby our unconscious activity influences our perceptions and actions that we are consciously aware of, and encourages us to fortify them with conscious choices, which reignites the unconscious activity once again and amplifies it. Coupled with our capacity for language, this self-awareness demands that we express these changes we perceive and experience in us and around us constantly. This is the source and function of the story. It communicates both external natural phenomena and our unconscious response to it, and reinforces the latter. I know that stories have been a part of all our lives since birth, and that hopefully the explanation I've just provided for their origin makes sense and follows a basic logic. However, this should not discourage us from reflecting on just how monumental an achievement storytelling is. The circumstances necessary to create the rational and scientific meteorologist, psychologist, or anthropologist who could explain nature objectively have only existed for about 500 years, and in all the millennia preceding that time, our ancestors relied on the most important and powerful tool ever created in order to properly express understanding and meaning in this universe. What's truly remarkable is that even today, with all the power of modern science at our fingertips, many scientists, especially psychologists, discover that the truths they're uncovering through the scientific method are already laid out quite clearly in myth and folktales. All stories, even postmodernist novels intent on defying traditional forms and themes, are a reflection of the world we live in and the way we consciously or unconsciously participate in it. My favorite example of this is one of the oldest plots in use, because even though it is ancient, it has never fallen out of favor, and it appears in almost every culture now and throughout history. The hero's journey, or monomyth, is a narrative structure that is characterized by a hero who leaves the safety of their home, confronts chaos out in the world, and finally returns home with whatever new goods and/or knowledge they have won. The study of this motif goes back to at least the 19th century, but it was best described by Joseph Campbell, who in turn was inspired by Carl Jung. In his studies of mythology and literature, Campbell recognized the hero's journey as being an archetypal theme, and so he attempted to map out its most basic structure. Several scholars since Campbell have also framed the hero's journey, each working from his template and producing something essentially like the format described here. Departure. The hero is stirred from the dormancy of their normal life and called to undertake a journey or quest. They initially reject this sudden change, but the perils of inaction are quickly made clear to them. After receiving the necessary wisdom, instructions, and/or instruments from a guide with extraordinary knowledge or abilities, the hero begins the journey by taking the first steps outside the familiar, and immediately begins a metamorphosis. In many classic Western action movies, a retired professional is asked to come out of retirement to help save the country or the world from a villain. He refuses, preferring the comfort of retired life with his wife and child. But when he returns home, he finds that the villain has already killed or captured his family. The professional then has an equipping montage, where a genius engineer gives him unique weapons, and an intelligence officer gives him the secret information necessary to locate and defeat the villain. The first act closes with him boarding the plane, train, or boat that will take him to the villain's lair or hideout, and as he leaves, he meditates or reflects to prepare himself for the trials to come. Initiation. As the hero emerges from their metamorphosis, a series of tests await them. The tests push the hero's limits. They may fail some of them, but they acquaint the hero with their strengths and weaknesses. The last of these tests is usually something tempting the hero, and they must overcome that temptation in order to progress. The hero then descends into an abyss, and they are forced to confront death and their own fallacies. The emergence from this abyss occurs when the hero lets go of the ego and becomes enlightened, and at this point they are fully prepared for the final stage. In many Hong Kong action movies, the young student of martial arts first fails to defeat his rival and his rival's gang. He often wallows in his defeat, succumbing to the temptation of drink before hitting rock bottom and facing his own insignificance. At this point, an old master or another external motivator forces him to rebuild himself, and after finally defeating his rival, he finds peace. Return. The hero must now return to the life they came from, though they are often reluctant to do so. They will be aided, either in the motivation to return, or they will be physically carried. Upon returning, they will find their old life corrupted, either by their own perspective on the monotony or ugliness that was always there, though previously disguised, or by some external force debasing it. But the hero shares the bounties of knowledge and the riches they have won on their journey, and this rejuvenates their old life, leaving the hero as a master of both worlds, as an illuminated being. An interesting take on this phase of the hero's journey is the many films and stories discussing the effects of trauma. The protagonist physically returns to their life, but is really trapped in the torture of their trauma, reluctant to expose themselves to the world. However, the right person comes into their life and helps them to share the trauma and the feelings associated with it, and the protagonist is finally able to grow and learn from the experience, becoming a fully functioning member of society once again. Why would this be such a common trope? One hypothesis is that it is designed to remind us of the experiences of our own lives and give them a greater sense of meaning. Every time we started at a new school when we were children, started a new job as adults, or left home to go live in a new place, we experienced this saga in one way or another. Starting something new in life is often a scary experience, for change is difficult and uncomfortable. But once we step into this change, we begin to transform. As we face challenges and problems we struggle to overcome, we discover that perhaps our fears were actually well-founded. The temptation of something instantly gratifying starts to pull us away from our new role, and we only begin to master this role when we overcome that temptation and address whatever fundamental axiom is holding us back. The mastery we develop can then apply to other aspects of our lives as well, if we don't give in to the pride of assuming it was something intrinsic and distinct about us that brought us here, and we acknowledge that it was actually the practice of discipline and effort that every person is capable of, then we become more competent and confident versions of ourselves. But then, why is this such a common experience? Well, if Jung and Campbell are right, it's because it is archetypal. If there is something fundamental within every person's unconscious that is designed to process events and changes in this manner, because evolution has determined that it is the most efficient method for producing competent individuals, then many different experiences should match the hero's journey. For example, every day we embark on the hero's journey as we follow the sun. We are reluctantly called out of the comfort of our beds with the sunrise. We clothe ourselves and eat breakfast, march across the threshold of our door, and mentally prepare as we transport ourselves to our jobs. There, we find problems waiting to be solved, struggle through them until the day is done, clock out only to be reminded we are going home to possibly recalcitrant roommates, bitter partners or spouses, or misbehaved children, and procrastinate by having some drinks while we bitch about our lives. Then we drag ourselves home, struggle with the bleak existence that awaits us there, and finally, if we are learning, as the sun goes down, we sit down to a nice meal and take a few moments to integrate the lessons of the day, choose to give them meaning and joy, and reflect on the miracle of life, before crawling into bed to rest, so we can do the same thing once again tomorrow. The saga of the week is the same, from the beginning of the work week through hump day, to the debauchery of Friday and Saturday, and then the perfectly timed church service on Sunday. The month, too, with its responsibilities of bills, reports, or quotas, calls us to undertake this journey, as does the year and the lifetime. Of course, the decisions we make can stall or delay us on this path, and we can actively choose something completely different. But if this makes sense to anyone who hears it, even just abstractly, then it lends credence to the hypothesis that it was the trials of nature that produced this archetype, and so it must reflect something fundamental about nature itself. When I first read about the hero's journey in Campbell's writings, I was struck by how much it reminded me of the cycle of the seasons. As the sun begins to dominate the sky on the spring equinox, it calls life out of the earth. As the days continue to grow longer, the plants and animals grow and prepare until the peak of summer. Then come the trials of the encroaching autumn, as plants hope to entice the animals frantically searching for food into choosing their fruits to spread their seeds. With the arrival of winter, all life descends into its holes and confronts death as night takes the sky back from the sun. If they make it through, they return to the surface with the sun and start the cycle once again. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that all nature was merely acting out this pattern. The sun seemed to do it on a day-to-day basis, as well as over the course of a year. The moon seemed to do it as well as it waxed and waned. Perhaps these myths had emerged as a way to make sense of the cycles of nature. At this point, I was not a student of astrology. In fact, I rejected it entirely, but I was familiar enough with it to know it followed the calendar, and so I decided to take a second look. To my amazement, what I found was that the cycle of the zodiac matched the format of the hero's journey almost perfectly, and more precisely than anything else I had yet to compare it to. It now appeared that thousands of years ago, these first city dwellers that I had always thought of as superstitious and barbaric, fumbling through successive attempts to sustain unjust power structures, might just actually be comparable to us today in intelligence, creativity, and self-awareness. They had not only discovered how to domesticate plants, invented writing, and been able to track the heavens and catalog the natural cycles well enough to be able to produce abundance capable of supporting cities. They had realized that their consciousness and behavior was tied to the patterns of the world they lived in, and they had mapped it out. In fact, considering how much less they had to work with than we do today, and how much more their resources were invested just in survival, it seems likely that they were actually far more ingenious and competent than us. Perhaps it was worth re-examining everything they had created that had a lasting impact. Perhaps it was time to consider astrology seriously, not as a primitive pseudoscience, and not as a preternatural force of the cosmos, but as a tradition of human beings attempting to discover and share the meaning and power of their behavior and the natural world it operated in. Now, I'm well aware that this will not be a perfectly clean investigation. there is already sloppiness that needs to be brought to light. First, the existence of the archetypes is a hypothesis, or an educated guess. It has not, and likely never can be, tested scientifically, so as to erase all the doubts and criticisms to which it is vulnerable. Second, the hero's journey is a very vague outline, so much so that it could probably be applied to anything if that thing is thought about abstractly enough. We human beings are well aware of our ability to project our conceptions about reality onto reality itself, and to anthropomorphize everything we interact with. Third, most of the hypothetical situations I have created thus far, and will continue to create, are speculative, and greatly oversimplified, and not to be taken as fact or historical accounts. However, I believe in the axiom of utility. If something cannot be proven objectively, put its ideas into practice and see if they are useful. Every time they are useful, the idea is stronger, and every time they are not useful, it is weaker. That is the leap of faith the realist must take in order to gain something from this series. They must be willing to put the water in and see for themselves if it holds, without knowing beforehand if it will. The blind believer, however, must be willing to open their eyes and have their illusions about the innate supremacy of astrology completely shattered. There is magic in astrology, but it is not the magic of a wizard casting spells. It is the magic of realizing there is incredible beauty to seeing this universe as it really is, not how we wish it to be. If both are willing to join me, we shall take a journey through the history of astrology, civilization, and humanity itself to discover if we can bring new life to this school and save it from our own ignorance.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed creating it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. And I hope that you will also consider supporting the creation of more Astrology Demystified videos by donating to my Patreon. The link is below in the description, where you'll also see links to Instagram and Facebook, where you can follow me and ask any questions you might have about astrology or Astrology Demystified. Stay stellar.